permanent makeup industry. We are going to be discussing microblading, of course, in the class, and then we will be discussing work with the machine. When we are discussing microblading, we're discussing the manual form of permanent makeup. So in the past, tattooing was all manual. So those, Egyptians and the Nubians and the Chinese and all of those, BC, we're working with manual techniques. If you like Nat Geo channel, you sometimes will still see that type of tribal tattooing being done manually, okay? So that's when we discuss manual, that's what we mean. Literally, you are using a tool with your hands. There's no electricity or anything like that, and you are manually implanting it. And microblading is in that category. When you are talking about machine work, there are different types of machines. And so in your book, you are going to see, if you turn to the second page there, you're going to see an example of a coil machine. We're not going to be discussing those in the course, not that they aren't valid pieces of equipment. They are, and Kay can speak to that. However, that is used predominantly in body art and tattooing, and so we won't be covering that in this training session. But then there are the digital and the rotary pieces of equipment that we will look at. And these are wonderful because you can adjust the setting, you can adjust the speed. Some of them actually come with settings for particular, brows, eyeliner, lips, whatever it is that you're working on. And one thing we can say, and it is the truth, you're going to end up not having just one machine you're working with. You will have multiple machines because you will find that some machines work better for certain things that you like to do. You're always going to want to have a backup machine. And we could probably all in this room a year and a half down the road be sitting talking and have our favorite machine and have it be a different piece of equipment. So we're going to give you that introduction to what we find works well to get you started, but just know that you will be throughout your career investigating other pieces of equipment. So today our focus is going to be, of course, microblading, and for the first couple of days, I should say, our focus will be microblading. And so I'm just going to quickly have you turn back to that page at the top. It has the microblading tool. It shows you the blade. And in the middle of that page, it talks a little bit about some of the benefits of using a manual tool, okay? And so when we look at the manual hand method, you have complete control. Now, you don't immediately have complete control. You have to get that control. But you're not holding a machine that's vibrating and, moving and things like that. So you can control that tool, okay? Also, no moving parts. You don't have to worry about mechanical failures. It is just your hand and your, the hand piece that you have. Color clogging and adjustments. Even the best machines, sometimes you will have to, work for a minute or so to get it unclogged. And with blades, you don't have to work with that at all. Minimal spattering. Keep in mind when we are working with blood and we're working with human fluid and things like that, the less splatter, the better. And it's not like with a machine where splattering, it's not like a slasher film or anything. But obviously, if you have something vibrating and moving, you're going to have more of the particulate that gets in the air. Another thing here, less pain and swelling. That's really going to depend on your technique. But as a rule, with microblading, we are working in the epidermal-dermal junction. So we're in that very lowest layer of the epidermis before we actually get into the dermis proper, okay? So there is less trauma there, that it's almost more like a paper cut. There's not that continual pounding of the needle. So for the most part, there's less problem there. And then when you're doing hair strokes, obviously a more natural look. Now, some people like that. Some people like more of a made-up look, and that's going to be something you'll discuss with them. But with hair strokes, with microblading, it can be hyper-realistic looking to where you honestly don't know what is a hair and what's their hair, if they actually do have some natural hair. Okay, so any questions on any of that? All good? Okay. Kay, did you want me to cover that? I was just going to say, we'll cover this. So here we have our epidermis and our dermis, and then the hypodermis, which really is that subcutaneous layer. The epidermis, you have multiple layers in the epidermis, and then there's this little junction here before you get into the dermis. Now the dermis is where you have all of your blood supply, you have your collagen, you have your elastin, all of that. In that little junction, and I'm gonna, here it is. Just take this off real quick here. A little bit of that. So we have the epidermis, dermis.
Feel free to take notes. So these are very important for you to take notes.
So the epidermis has multiple layers, and it is continually shedding. So if you've heard, exfoliation, cell renewal, things like that, that's because the epidermis is always renewing itself. So if you implant something too shallow in the epidermis, it is just going to slough off when those cells slough off. Okay? Here is what's called the dermal epijunction or dermal epidermal junction, and that is connected to both the epidermis and to the dermis. If we can implant right in here, now this is microblading I'm discussing. The dermis does not change over. It doesn't have that cell turnover monthly the way that the epidermis does. And so we're not quite in the dermis down here, because if we get too low in the dermis, now it's going to, the further down you get into the dermis, the cooler that color is going to look, and you're going to start getting blue and gray and more ashy tone. So when you're looking at hyper-realistic microblading, we want to keep that as superficially as possible without being too superficial in that we lose all of the pigment. And part of the reason that we do need to do a touch-up about 4 to 6 weeks later is because some of that pigment is actually going to be trapped in those skin cells down at the base layer of the epidermis and will be sloughed off. But if we, again, our goal is going to be to implant it in the sweet spot, and the sweet spot has little capillaries. So when we are working in the sweet spot, we're going to get tiny little blood drops, okay? And that's going to show us that we've reached that dermal epidermal junction. Now, when you go into permanent makeup, of course, now we are going to implant a little bit deeper because we're looking for a different look. And then we're going to be trying to work more in this upper layer of the dermis, which is called the papillary dermis. Again, not wanting to go too deep because then we're going to start getting all kinds of funny colors. And when Kay discusses blade placement and things, it's going to make a whole lot of sense as well, because if you are going straight into the skin, you're going to get a beautiful hair stroke. You're going to see that thin hair stroke. If you go this way and you implant pigment all along here, guess what? It's going to show all the way up as a big fat solid stroke. It's not going to show just that one little line of color. Does that make sense? So, when we're being particular about how you're holding your blade and not tilting and not going in too far sideways, that's all going to be important. And it all comes down to skin structure. All right? Okay.
Can you explain how thick the epidermis is?
The epidermis is about the thickness of a piece of paper. Literally, when we are looking at our skin, we're looking at the dermis. Our dermis is visually showing through the epidermis. That is how thin. And with some people it's a little thinner, some people, obviously a little thicker. But a piece of paper is about the thickness of the epidermis. So you don't have to put a lot of pressure on that blade to get through that epidermis. So one of the things that can be an issue when you first begin is having too heavy of pressure. And we're going to discuss the different skin types and textures and things like that, comparing it to different things like eggs and grapes. But I even found that practicing initially on a banana was helpful because I could kind of get the feel of that thin epidermis. Dermis, of course, is much thicker. But the goal is to get that junction so that we get some implantation of that pigment that is not going to be sloughed off, but not to go below that to where now it is going to look too dark and blue and more solid looking.
One question.
Yes.
This might not be covered later on, but